friends, to Beyond the Crucible, the podcast that dares to talk about setback and failure, but not so we can commiserate. It's so we can elevate. I'm Gary Schneeberger, the co-host of the show, and our mission today is to offer you the hope that your Crucible experiences, those challenges and setbacks you've faced or are facing at this moment, don't define you. They refine you. They did not happen to you. They happened for you. And I don't know many people, I think I don't really know anybody who knows that as well as the founder of Beyond the Crucible, the host of this show, and my friend, Warwick Fairfax. Warwick, we have, by my count, and I've maybe lost count, but the 2,472nd guest from Australia on our show. But she is a good one, and all kidding aside, this is going to be a robust conversation, and I can't wait for it.
Absolutely, Gary, and I'm very much looking forward to it too.
That guest, folks, is Stephanie Woollard, who is a distinguished social entrepreneur and visionary leader renowned for her transformative work in business and sustainable development. As the founder of 7 Women, Stephanie has forged a path of empowerment and innovation, leveraging her expertise to inspire and guide business leaders toward impactful change. Steph also thrives as a businesswoman who has established and continues to lead successful ventures, including her Irish Heritage Tour company. Now she guides local and global business leaders, helping them uncover their missional purpose through Halftime Australia's Emerging Leaders program, and has taken on a director role with Food for Thought. Her passion is to motivate and mobilize people of impact. Warwick, sounds like you and Stephanie have some shared passions here.
Well, Stephanie, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. And I really enjoyed your book, From a Tin Shed to the United Nations. I mean, the title alone is it's a fantastic title. I mean, it's like, what's that about? I got to read that, right? Which is the idea. So well done. And I loved hearing, just reading your story and the work you do with 7 Women and hands-on development. And I guess we're connected through some friends in Halftime Australia, John Sycamore and Glenn Williams, and they do such great work there. So before getting into kind of what you do with 7 Women and how that started, I'd love to just hear some of the backstory. And you talk about that in the book, but you had a really sort of interesting upbringing with some kind of fun parents, creative, entrepreneurial. Not everybody has parents like yours. It just seems like, I don't know, they seem pretty good in a lot of ways, and maybe every way, I don't know. But so talk a bit about your upbringing and maybe some of the experiences you had that made you open to what you would do later. So yeah, talk a bit about what was it like for young Stephanie growing up and I guess outside of Melbourne, right? In Victoria and Australia. So yeah.
Yep. Thank you so much for having me. And I loved reading your book as well, Crucible Leadership. It was very insightful and could resonate with a lot of that as well. So it's great to be here. I'll start with my beautiful granny, Nora Delia Brown. She was an Irish Catholic and a really fierce, courageous, strong, head of the household woman. And she was married to my grandfather, who was a Scottish man, Frank Brown. And I really want to acknowledge her because I think that really carried on through, Mum, my parents, the strong sort of Christian values that we were raised with, even though we were non-church going and, just once a year, normally on Christmas Eve or something, we'd go to the local church to be part of the community. But the values that we were raised with were very much around generosity. And I'm from a family of entrepreneurs. So my dad ran his own business. He's just sold that. My mum has her own business as a naturopath and a Pilates instructor. So very much has kept the family healthy our whole lives, which I'm very grateful for. My brother has his own business called Bulk Bullion, selling gold and silver, but he's been an entrepreneur since I remember him trying to charge me for renting his Game Boy to play Tetris, and I was outraged. I was like, this is ridiculous. How can you charge your own sister for renting your Game Boy? And my sister has her own coaching business to help kids with learning difficulties and teachers international students English. So very busy household. It was always open, lots of people coming in, coming out. And I used to every now and again escape to my granny's house and stay there overnight. It was just, there was such a peace in that house. And sometimes she wouldn't even know, and I'd wake up in the morning and I'd be sitting in her kitchen at the table, and she'd be delighted to see me. So so that was, we had a really great childhood and family holidays every year. And my dad, I admire him a lot, how he's had sort of great integrity in business, looked after his staff members. As I was growing up, ironically, he had a tin shed in our backyard that he started his engineering business. So, and I just remember he was always available. I used to wander out there to see what he was doing when I was little, and he'd always drop his tools, give us the attention. So, I would say my parents have been very present through all of our main events in life, which has been, just celebrating Father's Day a couple of days ago, and just we do this family thing where when it's anyone's birthday or celebration, we call it Momo in the middle, because Momo is a Nepalese dumpling, and I started it on my Nepal tours, but basically put the person in the middle and just say beautiful things about them, qualities that we admire in them. So that for my dad was, I'm really grateful for his love, and knowing that he, has always loved us so much, and that, has been very much part of our shaping and development as humans. So that's a bit about my upbringing. I always had this desire to make a difference, and I'm not quite sure where that came from, but for as early as I can remember in high school, and I was always sort of putting my hand up for all the different activities and was involved in absolutely everything. I thought if I get involved in absolutely everything, then I will find out what I'm really interested in. So I did that. And I always had this mantra in high school: I want to become successful by making other people successful. That was always sort of my heart, and I've just sort of followed that journey.
It's funny, as you would know, in Australia, and I've talked about this on the podcast, there's something called the tall poppy syndrome, which, just to explain to non-Australian listeners, that basically if you do well in any field of endeavor other than sports, it's okay to be good in sports, but anything else, the arts or business, they say, so you think you're better than us. What's your problem? But it sounds like you didn't have those influences, which is unusual. It would be, surely to goodness, there'd be a sibling, a cousin, somebody that say, there you go, Steph, you head in the clouds and come back to reality and get a real job. But it sounds like your family was supportive of anything you did, even in, high school, which is unusual in Australia, if you get my drift.
Yeah. I must have had my head in the clouds so far that I didn't hear people that were saying those things, because I have no memory of people saying that sort of thing. But it's a very interesting thing in my life. I think I sometimes I pick up on a lot, but somehow I don't pick up on people saying negative things. And a number of times, my mum or a friend or someone will say, did you hear that person just swear at you and you accidentally cut them off? Or, and I'll say, no, I completely missed that. So somehow I feel like I've been, protected from that sort of thing dragging me down. But I often think if I didn't have the parents and upbringing I had, I would be off the rails, because I am not one to conform to rules that don't make sense. And I always love sort of, shortcuts and doing things creatively. And I was always drawn to people that are a bit outside the box. I found them more interesting, and I found that they had so much value to bring, but they didn't necessarily know it themselves. So I loved sort of mining gold in people and encouraging them and supporting them, and creating opportunities for them to really discover what they have to bring to the table. And it was just sort of this thread throughout my life where I felt that we used to have a lot of volunteers and interns with the charity, and a lot of those sorts of people were people that people would write off quite easily because they looked different or they sounded different, but I loved those types of people because they had so much to offer. So, but often think to myself, if I didn't have the right people around me, I would possibly be in jail. I'm not sure.
I'd like to talk a bit about kind of what you do, but there's also a crucible in there with your grandma, I guess you call Gran. So help me understand, had you started 7 Women yet before your grandmother died, or just help us understand the sequence of that?
Sure. So 2006, I started 7 Women. So I was 22 when I ventured over to Nepal and wanted to volunteer. So I went with the Duke of Edinburgh, and that's when I sort of met the 7 Women. And then I think it was 2014 that my grandma passed away. So it was quite some time after it, when I was just at a stage with the charity where there was over 5,000 women that were trained and employed, and I felt like there's something missing. There's a bit of a missing link. You know, they had provision and all their physical needs met, but there was a missing link because their mindsets were still the same. So there was still bits of bickering here and there, and, you know, poverty mindset, and just these different, you know, I suppose that the missing link was the spiritual, that sort of aspect of it. And I didn't know what that was at the time, so I thought it was knowledge. So I went to Sweden to study a master's in peace and conflict research, because I thought if I get smarter, I'll be able to add more and find this missing link. And it was that time that my grandma, passed away when I was overseas, and she was here in Australia. And that was a real, it wasn't sort of a crucible moment in terms of persecution or things going pear-shaped. It was a great loss to the family, and someone who I suppose represented that unconditional love of God in my life, and that peace and that presence. She would just sort of sit at her kitchen table and listen, you know, whenever I used to rock up and have something I wanted to get off my chest, or, you know, something, and she used to just listen. And she wouldn't even necessarily give advice. She would say, have you thought of praying? You know, have you prayed about that? And I didn't even know what that meant at the time, and how do you pray? Who do you pray to, sort of thing. But she was very wise and very present.
Wow. So let's talk a bit about kind of how you founded it in 2006, and just for US listeners and others, Duke of Edinburgh Awards, it's like a high school deal. It's very prestigious, and you won that award, which is amazing. So that led to going on, I guess it's with, was it OzQuest, organization that toured Nepal. And I love how you write in the book how, I mean, you're somebody that kind of wanders around a bit, like on these tour groups. There's a tour, and then if there's a moment, it's like, okay, off goes Steph to have a little adventure, as we say in Australia, a little bit of walkabout, if you will, see what's going to happen. So it seems like on one of these kind of, let's do our own thing here, you met a woman there, and it really changed the direction of your life. So just talk about those women and what happened when you met that woman. You followed her back to where she lived. Just talk about that, because it's an interesting story.
Sure, yeah. So before I went to Nepal, I had that sort of nervous, excited feeling that this trip was going to change my life. And I didn't know anyone that was on the tour group. I just sort of booked it and then thought, okay, I'm going. I knew that it was going to be an incredible trip. And it was actually on the second trip that I went back to Nepal after the first volunteering one, where I was a participant that was wandering off, as you said, constantly, rather than digging holes to lay the foundation. I think I was behind the shovel, lasted about 1 minute, and then I was off looking for someone to meet, wanted to meet the locals. And so the second trip, I miraculously, after that behaviour, I got asked back to co-lead these groups. So I was co-leading a group, and I stayed on a few days after the tour, went back home, and I was wandering down the back streets, very curious still to meet the locals and visit these organisations that were having impact. And I saw a very clearly physically disabled woman carrying 2 heavy bags, and she turned into a tiny tin shed. And being my curious self, I poked my head around the corner and saw 6 other women in this tin shed with her. And Sangita, one of the women, spoke broken English. She was the only one that spoke broken English, and she was able to share some of these stories of these women who I couldn't quite reconcile with their beautiful, bright smiles. And, you know, I was sort of looking at them, hearing their stories and thinking, wow, this doesn't match up, that they'd been discriminated against in their villages, and, seen as bad luck in their society, because there's a cultural belief, there in the Hindu religion that if they're disabled in this life, they were evil in a past life. So they were, up against it with what they were doing. And they actually, when I, looked into the tin shed, they had this open flame where they were melting wax in this big wok looking thing, and they were pouring the wax into these ancient looking stainless steel candle makers. So that actually inspired me, because they were enterprising, and at the time there were 10 to 12 hour electricity cuts in Nepal, and people needed to buy candles for their shops and their homes to keep things lit up. So that was actually a really enterprising idea. But they said because of the way that they physically appeared, they weren't able to sell many candles at all. So that was sort of heartbreaking for me to meet them and see the beautiful light in them and their radiant smiles, and then hear those things. And one of the women, Sandhya, actually hid behind another woman and sort of covered her deformity around her face. And that really tormented me afterwards. I thought, it's, for someone to be that ashamed about how they look or how they feel. And I sort of feel like, well, while they were physical disabilities, but we all have those, like whether they're limiting beliefs or whether it's shame that we carry, and it squashes our ability to share, our gifts with the world and feel that be confident in ourselves that we are of value. So that really got me, and I walked to the nearest internet cafe afterwards, and I called Mum back in Melbourne and said, Mum, I've just met these 7 disabled women. They're living in a tin shed. I've got $200 because I was a student. I only had $200 left because I just bought so much crap in the shops over there. You know how you're just in love with the place when you're over there and you just think, that's beautiful, big rugs, and I could barely fit it in my suitcase. And I'd only had $200 left. So I said to Mum, do you think I can make a difference? Do you think I can do something to help these women? And I remember her saying, go for it. You'll be able to make a small difference and we'll support you. I'm not sure if Mum realised how much she would need to support me, her and Dad, over the next 2 decades while I pursued this passion. But yeah, they were always a great support doing, took the initial products back the women made, and Dad would get up at 5 a.m. in the morning with me and pack the back of his trailer with all these, felt puppets and God knows what. We were importing scarves and all these that the women were making to sell these and raise money to send back to them so they could firstly get a better place to live.
I mean, what's remarkable to me is some people looking at that scene, they wouldn't instantly pivot to, oh, how can I help them? That like, this is just awful. I mean, just as you describe in the book, these poor women with physical challenges, and in some cases, it was because of lack of medical care, that these were injuries that were preventable, or at least could have been handled, like in Australia or the US. They wouldn't necessarily have to be disabled for the rest of their lives. So some people will look at that and say, it's wrong, it's unfair. It just would, and that's appropriate to have those feelings and emotions, obviously. And I'm sure you had them. It must have been devastating to see this and saying, how is this possible? How could this happen on this planet? And I'm sure you felt that, but yet you didn't just stop there at the shock of what you were seeing. You pivoted to, well, how can I help these people? A lot of people would just say, well, I'm just one person. I can't help these people. I can't change the government, the society, the culture. But it sounds like you went instantly to, so what can I do? I mean, most people wouldn't think that way. Why do you think you pivoted almost immediately to, I got to help these women? Because that's not, to use a word, normal, if you will.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I think it's just the injustice of the situation, seeing these beautiful women thinking, no, you can do something. This is like, I just thought, imagine their future and that limitation. They were still young. Imagine what they would become in future if they continued to believe in this ridiculous cultural belief that was going to really hinder their ability to live quality lives. And the other thing that really inspired me was I asked the women, what do you want to do in future? And they said, every single one of them said, we want to help women in our own village. And that really inspired me, because I thought, wow, if I invest in these women, they've got such a spirit of generosity and hearts to help and serve others that it'll have a ripple effect. So that really moved me when they answered in that way. And that sort of spurred me on to think, okay, what can we do to, what are the first steps?
So let's talk about these next steps. Because obviously, you've helped thousands of women. I think I read maybe over 5,000 women. I think that was, I don't know, like 8 years ago. It's probably a bit out of date. I'm sure it's a lot more now, but you didn't know that back in 2006. You probably weren't thinking, okay, I'm going to have this big thing with facilities and ecotourism and all sorts of things. And I love kind of some of those stories. I don't know if it was trying to make a kookaburra or some kind of bird, and the beak was missing, or it's just they didn't know how to measure. Just talk about those early stories in which growing up the way you did in Australia, it felt like, well, it's kind of obvious you do this, that, and the other, but they didn't grow up that way. So talk about, it just was not easy those first few months, first few years, as you were trying to do what you might think would be simple in the West, but to them, just not having that education, it wasn't easy. Let's talk about those early days, because it was not easy, getting this started.
Yeah, no, it was very, so what kick started me into action was I wanted to help the women. I wanted to help these first 7 women. I had no grand ideas or plans for what that would look like in the future. I just wanted to help them get a better place to live. So I was thinking of ways to do that. And I'd also seen a few organisations that were corrupt, that were based on the handout, and that created all sorts of implications, like that sort of sense of entitlement or helplessness. It really perpetuated that in the people that were being helped. So I wanted to, even if it meant we'd grow slowly, I wanted the women to understand that they needed to work to earn the money. And there were 2 reasons behind that. One of the main reasons was I wanted them to feel their own value through that experiential, them making things, learning, making, earning. So that's sort of how but there were so many challenges in that. And Sangeeta at the time, who was leading the organisation, it was very interesting in terms of she, like, a few probably 6-12 months into it, there were, I was connecting people, and there were more people coming to the organisation and being connected with the organisation. And I was sort of pleading with her, let's just stick with me and I will help, build this slowly. But there were lots of people coming in and offering different things, and some of them were helpful, some were not helpful, and sort of a distraction and taking us, a few steps back. And so that was tricky, because in Nepal there can be a sense of short-term thinking and not long-term, and that's a bit of a difference in the West, and because they have to think like that to survive, because it's a poorer country. And so it was like things like that were a bit of a challenge, because she was grabbing at all the opportunities that were coming, but it was actually a bit of a hindrance to what we were building. So that was one of the challenges. And the other one was, we had a board member, Ganesh, who was a beautiful guy, but he was very skeptical of me, because in Nepal they don't volunteer. They don't. So he was like, why is she helping? What does she want out of this?
Right. There's got to be an angle, right?
Yeah. And he was sort of, so things like that are hard to rectify. So I just had to sometimes, be aware that I was seen in that way, and that was okay, because I was on this mission to help these women. So even in Nepal, the charity sort of, it's not an industry, but the charity has, Nepalese people tend to think that it's a business, because there's truth to that. It has become a business in some areas, orphanages and horrific things that have happened. So just that interesting challenge of people misunderstanding you and your heart intentions, but continuing on anyway, and not letting it bother you, I suppose, as well. And then, another challenge was the products. We had the women's skill level was very basic. They could knit. So we started with knitting products, but, trying to identify who was good at what and who could do what as well was, very much part of sorting out who we were and where we were heading and what we were doing, but also generating income. At the start, the women were illiterate, so that had all sorts of implications that I didn't foresee as a Westerner who's grown up with an education, and even measuring, things on the ruler, or great that they're earning income now, but how they're getting ripped off in the local market. So it's sort of a bit useless for them to be earning money and not being able to count it. So all of these things was like, okay, we've got to do this literacy thing before they can, So lots of those little learnings along the way. I remember being curled up in my room, like in tears, after a cargo load arrived of these hand puppets. So they first started making the knitting products and hot pink ponchos, fluorescent yellow knitted bags, and I thought they were absolutely magnificent. I packed them in my bag. I went back to Australia and I laid them out on my parents' floor. We had our first fundraiser. About 20 people came, and everyone basically left that night saying, happy to donate, but keep the products. And I thought, how did they not, I was confused me, like, how does no one want to take one of these products? They're beautiful. I saw the women making them. Sure. And so that was a bit of a wake up. I then took them to my university and started a market stall, recruited a few of my classmates as volunteers, and again all day stood there 9 till 5, nothing, sold absolutely nothing. So that was a bit of a wake up to maybe we need to design some different products for the Australian market. So part of that was these hand puppets. I was Googling things, and looking back now, probably not the best idea to copy someone else's product. I had an email at one stage from National Geographic saying, we're going to sue you. You've copied our I think it was a parrot finger puppet that we'd copied, and rightly so. But at the time, that didn't even cross my mind. I was just desperate to find these products that the women could make. So the cargo load came of these hand puppets that I'd gone over there. We'd got the felt. We'd done together we'd created them, ran out of time to do the cockatoo, which is a famous Australian bird with, and so I sent a photo across to them, and they had missed the beak because it was sort of camouflaged into the black background. And so I got 200 of these hand puppets, all beakless. And I was like nearly in tears thinking, this is way too, the amount of effort and materials and costs that went into producing those, and they're all missing their beaks. So things like that were just like, oh man, how are we going to go out? So I ended up convincing a friend of mine who was a primary school teacher to make it a class project to make these beaks and sew them on the cockatoo so we could sell them and make some money to send back. So lots of those little growth pains in the beginning happened. But throughout all of those, I think I sort of kept my perspective because I knew the struggles that the women faced. And so to me, that was, minimal compared to how these women were living on a day-to-day basis.
What I love about those stories, Stephanie, is you had success, you were making a difference, and that didn't stop the crucibles from coming, right? I mean, that's important for folks who are listening and watching to remember as you're pursuing your life of significance, and you were smack in the middle of your life of significance, those things that you just described happened and happened again and happened again. And your attitude about them now, you're smiling, you're laughing, you've come through it on the other side. What's your, what advice do you have for people who maybe aren't on the other side yet, who have just confronted one of those moments where they're lying in bed and they're crying because that didn't go the way that they expected it to do? How do you keep the will and the perspective and the passion to keep going? Because that is where a lot of people can find themselves. Yeah.
I think there's different levels of crucibles, but for me, I've always been obsessed with growth and learning. So I knew that even in these challenges, I was growing and I was learning. And I sort of, I always had this faith that I didn't really know where it came from, but I knew that like everything happened for a reason at that stage. And I knew that, you know, everything was happening for a reason. I'd seen too much, you know, favour and open doors and things that got resolved miraculously in a country and context like Nepal, which is, you know, quite impossible to make some things happen. And so I would just sort of encourage people to shift their mindset around challenges. And I was also even thinking last night, my mum used to say to us, good thing, the best is yet to come. Good, you know, the future's going to be bright. So that was sort of ingrained in us as kids. And she even used to do this little thing. I remember primary school, even high school, when we were going through something, she'd say, right, how are you feeling? So we'd share how we were feeling. And then she'd draw like a circle on the ground, step into this circle and pretend that you're, you know, 5 years ahead and does this. So she'd sort of shrink the problem and the challenge, which was really effective as a little activity to do, to step into, you know, to physically move into a more positive mindset, and then say there's going to be great things happening in future to encourage us. So that was a really, lots of those little things helped us in challenging times.
Having an optimistic mindset, a growth mindset, is just so critical. And you obviously you had as your North Star, certainly back then, is, why am I doing this? It's for these 7 women and the others. You know, that's why I'm doing this. It might be challenging for me. It's a lot more challenging for them every day, right?
Yeah,
so it just sounds
and
like
character building.
Yeah, you just had this attitude that attitude helped you get through all of these crucibles. So I think we could all do well to learn from the attitude that you had. That makes sense.
I think as well, just when anything goes pear-shaped, I've always looked at, because I want to be the best person that I can be in life, and I just saw all these experiences that sort of help with that, help to shape you. And I think there's an example in the Bible of being the clay on the potter's wheel, and
yes.
God's sort of shaping us into what he wants for us. And if everything runs smoothly all the time, it's, you know, we're not going to be this magnificent masterpiece, but he's shaping our character constantly through trials. So whenever a trial comes, I've always asked myself, okay, what part do I have to play in this? Do I need to learn something? Do I need to humble myself and say sorry? Or did I do the wrong thing? Was I acting out of ego? Or I've always first looked at myself and then sort of seen, and sometimes really hurtful things happen. And I think the most challenging crucibles on my journey have been matters of the heart, when people sort of disappoint you or let you down, or people that you've trusted have really betrayed that trust. And you just, you know, they're really tricky ones because they do have an impact. And so, but just to sort of first start with, okay, what role have I played in this particular situation? And then if I am sort of, if I do feel that I haven't, and that it's, you know, I'm innocent in the situation, then there must be a bigger purpose for this happening. And then just surrendering it to God, because we can't possibly carry all the things that happen to us in life, because we'll be like crawling around, you know, with the weight of it.
So this business, it sounds like it was obviously growing, and as part of that, you did this master's course in Sweden, and that was when was that? When you did that?
That was 2013 to 2015.
So by then you had a few years with 7 women and trying to start that, and you talk about, you know, your grandma dying at that time, and that was another crucible, because you've mentioned just how close you were, and it's funny that the chapter that you talk about, that the title of the chapter is Burnout, and you're somebody that seems like a very strong person that can get through pretty much anything. You know, Steph can't get through it, then nobody can, I think probably your friends might say. And there's be truth in that, I would guess. But somehow, at least from a personal crucible standpoint, that was one of the biggest. So talk about, and you talked a bit about that before, but, you know, what did that feel like, and why was that so devastating? And sounds like there might have been some other things going on behind the scenes, not just your grandma dying.
Yeah. So that was probably one of two main crucible moments. The other one was sort of a bit of a betrayal of trust with people involved in the charity on the ground, which didn't have too much of an impact to the charity or the people who were supporting, but me personally, and sort of had to carry that and not share it with many people, which was, quite tough to get through alone. But my grandma passing away, that was sort of after that situation happened. And I think my grandma, because of what she stood for and her presence in my life of that unconditional love, it was like before I knew, my journey is sort of quite, before I knew God, that sort of really brought me into union with God after she passed away, because I was really stuck in the grief. I was grief stricken, and I had to fly back to Sweden and do my internships in Argentina and Myanmar, and these are places that I sort of ran out of energy. So it did feel like burnout. And for years, people had been warning me about burnout. I even had people coming up to me after my speaking engagements. I remember this guy, he was probably around 65 something. He was in tears. Obviously he had tears rolling down his eyes, and he said, I just want to let you know, like, make sure you look after yourself as well. You're giving so much to these women. And that was really confusing to me at the time. Like, oh, the poor guy, he's probably connected, something in his own life that relates to that. But I couldn't quite get where he was coming from in terms of me, because I was on a high. I was living my best life, living my passion. But for years people were warning me, be careful of burnout, be careful of burnout. And I never quite got that, because I thought, if you're passionate and living your best life, you're just, I was on a high the whole time. So that was, so then when Granny died, it was the first time that I actually, felt burnt out. I couldn't get myself out of that grief, and I flew back. I remember Mum sort of called me that morning. I was in Sweden and said, got a message when I woke up, as soon as you're awake, call me. Called her, and she passed Granny on the phone and said, tell her that you love her. So I could, Granny was barely talking, but I said, I love you, Granny. And she was able to say that back to me. And then I just went into sort of like action mode, booked the flights home. A couple of hours later at the airport, ready to fly. And I just on the way to the airport saw a message that my cousin had posted on Facebook saying, I never thought this day would come. Bye, Granny. And it just hit me like a ton of bricks. And the whole plane ride home, I was just sort of like, I actually wrote this massive letter to God on the plane ride home, and it took about 7-8 hours. I just wrote, which was pretty incredible considering I didn't know Jesus or I'd never read the Bible. I remember when I got back to Australia, I went straight to like a meeting that the family was having to plan the funeral, and they wanted me to say a eulogy. And it was very surreal, when people are experiencing grief, loss, or these really tough moments in life. It's like you look at the world and everyone's still going about their business, and you're sort of like in a different headspace in a different world. And so, I remember I wrote the eulogy, but at her funeral a couple of days later, I read it out as if I was speaking to her, because I couldn't quite get my head around reading it out as if she'd passed. So it was like she was still sitting in the pews in front of me, and I was reading to her, acknowledging her. And I remember then the wake after the funeral, everyone was celebrating, and we had the Irish music and the Irish dancing, and everyone was sort of happy. And I was just like not home. So I walked across the road to my granny's house from my uncle's house where we were having the wake, and her spare keys were still there. I let myself into her house and went up to her bedroom, and I just lay on her bed and cried and cried and cried and cried until it was evening. And I think what made that period of time a bit trickier was I felt alone. I think like sometimes in the West we deal with grief a bit differently. And I just sort of felt, Mum was going through the grief and in her own way, and it was like, who do you just feel like, who do I call? Because I don't want to call someone and just cry flat out on the phone. Like, what are they going to do now? So I just, in that time, then I had to fly back I was in Argentina a couple of weeks later, and that's when I thought, who am I going to call? I had tried everything in my own might to get my joy back. I was thinking to myself, what is going to bring, and I thought, well, meeting new people and going out and about, gives me joy. So because I didn't know anyone in Argentina, it was quite hard to do that. So I rang my friend Ricky one night, who had told me 4 years earlier that he had seen Jesus appear in his bedroom. And at the time, I thought I was busy with my charity, and I thought, wow, that's an amazing experience, but kept, going in the busyness of life. And then when I was, having my own struggle, I thought, who do I call? Well, I'm going to call Ricky. So called him and I said, Ricky, how do I pray? How do I connect with God? And I think he said something like, just pray and ask God, if you're real, show yourself to me. I want to know you, have an encounter with you, not just sort of theoretically. So yeah, I did that. And it was as if I can look back on my life now and see how God has taken me by the hand every step of the way. He put the most incredible friend, who was an Argentinian, in my life at that point. And we went traveling up north and south of Argentina, and this person was just absolute love. Like, they were just love. So that sort of brought me back to life. And then the rest of the masters in Sweden, I was studying peace and conflict research. So it was one of those experiences, and I could resonate with your book, being in certain circles and situations where it looks absolutely perfect on the outside. Like, the red carpet was being rolled out for us because we were scholarship winners, but it just sort of didn't match with who I was or my heart for making a difference. And I assumed when I went over there that it would be like I'd meet some like-minded people that cared about the planet and the people and wanted to really, because lots of those people that graduate these top universities go into running the world, being in positions of leadership. But it was very much, I felt, unfortunately at the time, climbing the ladder, dog eat dog, all sort of photo here, photo there, but nothing behind it. And that really distressed me, because I could, I met some great friends, but there were a lot of, so all of those experiences are so that they sort of, I don't know the word, but you sort of like lose a bit of a sense of, you're like, am I going crazy, or am I just in an environment that doesn't suit me? Sometimes you ask yourself those sorts of questions. So, miraculously I finished the masters, and that was 100% God, because my grandma, before she died, was praying for my statistics, because I'm not a statistics person at all.
I remember reading that was crazy.
Yeah.
I could call up a couple of friends, and that was a miracle. It felt like, at least for those of us who aren't good at statistics.
Yeah. So to get high distinction in statistics after, I thought they had the wrong name. I had to double check that it was definitely me. So that was an absolute, because I actually didn't understand the questions in that exam. So that was a real miracle. I feel like sort of God took me by the hand since then. And, there were a few other experiences that happened that really led me in towards to developing my faith. All of these spiritual principles that I believe came from, the Christian values I was brought up with, I already sort of could relate to in some way or another. If you give generously, then you're provided for. And I just had crazy provision when I built my charity, because I wasn't paid for the first 11 years, and then I started my tour company. So I had people paying my salary for 2 years that had just come along and said, we want to just pay you a salary to keep doing what you're doing. So my faith strengthened when I started reading the Bible, and I knew what God's word said and the promises that he has promised us and declared over our lives, like to prosper us and to not harm us, and that we were all created for, I was reading in your book last night, a life that's tied to your innate gifting, overlaid with your passions, values and beliefs, is like rocket fuel. And that was my experience, because I just took step by step in the direction of my passion. And who gives us those passions? God. Like, how can we have such different passions from one person to the next. Like, I like art, the next person's super talented in engineering or maths, for statistics, for example. It's like, whoa, how can we be created so differently? And then it said, the only vision that can succeed is one that is uniquely true to you and who you are. Vision occurs when deep-seated beliefs and passions are combined with your unique wiring. Crafting a vision for yourself that fully aligns with who you are sets the foundation for you to live and lead with uncompromised authenticity. A vision that is not tied to who you are, what you believe in, and what you are passionate about will tend to go nowhere, however noble it is. So that was just amazing to read, because that's been my lived experience. And that's what we tried to do with the charity as well. We had women making hand puppets that had disabilities in their hands, so that really didn't suit them. But then when we asked them, what is on your heart, what are your dreams? Sandhya, one of the women, said she wanted to learn to read and write. So we invested in her, and she then went to the villages and trained village leaders to teach their people how to read and write. And just the ripple effect that comes from us actually staying in our lane and following those passions that God has put in us and on our hearts is, we get favor and we get blessings that come with that enable us to achieve things that we could never do in our own might.
So let me just focus on what you're doing now. Obviously, 7 Women has grown hugely, hands-on development, which sounds like it's sort of like a, life-changing travel adventures, experiences, and the work you do with leadership, with Half Time. I mean, you do a lot of things. So just talk about the life of Stephanie Woollard, which a lot of it's 7 women, which is huge, but there's a lot of things you do in life. So what do you feel like your calling is now? Because it sounds like it's, I don't know if the word is broadened or shifted or deepened, or I don't know quite what the right word is, but, talk about your calling now.
Yeah, so I think calling has always been the same. It's just shifted platforms. And I think I've always wanted to encourage and uplift people and, help them to get a step close to their dreams and their goals. So that was when I met the 7 women, it was about helping them get set up in life. And I handed that over about a year and a half ago, maybe 2 years now, to the local people. And that was always the plan after 17 years. So they're doing a great job at that, and they've got great hearts for their community. So I felt like I could trust them and hand it over. And, a lot of people said around that time, it's how do you feel handing your baby over? But I don't see it like that. It's like, no, there'll be the next place for me to make the next bit of impact. And it never defined me or who I was. That I've seen people where what they do really is their identity. And I think that's dangerous, because what if you get sick of it? I met a guy, John Sycamore, who I'm working with now. And when he shared his vision, it was for business leaders to come together and create community and support each other and get around each other. And that really spoke to me, because I felt that I wanted to. 7 Women was a charity, but it was made up of 4 businesses basically, which was, the manufacturing, the cooking school, a guest house, and then my tour company. And so I've always believed in business principles, because, our businesses can do so much good. We can provide jobs for people, look after them. And then with the money, you can be generous. You can decide how you use those profits. So when John spoke about his vision of creating 2,000 groups around Australia, of these values-based business networking groups that also had a component of faith exploration, I thought, I want to be part of that. So I was so over-enthusiastic, I think I freaked him out and his EA on that day, because I want to meet with you and discuss this. And so I caught up with John a couple of months in a row, and he said, I think there's a role for you here with Food for Thought. So now I'm working for Food for Thought as their National Development Director and spokesperson. And then I run these emerging leaders programs, which is part of Half Time out of the US, but that was brought to Australia by John. And that's really for people in business that are wanting to grow and do a 360 on themselves and reflect on, who am I? Am I in the right position? So many people are unfulfilled because they're in the wrong place. They're like a, round peg in a square hole, and they don't quite know why they're not feeling fulfilled. But as that little passage in your book says, they're not in the, they don't have that rocket fuel. experience because they're not in the right spot.
They don't have a sense of calling that, you know, get them up in the morning. So, I mean, that is just so inspiring, kind of what you're doing now, because you're helping future Stephanie Woollards, you know, find their passion, their dream, you know, maybe younger folks, maybe others who they have skills, but it's like, well, what is really the point? I'm producing this product, but so what? What's the vision? What's the calling? Where's God in this? Where's some higher purpose? And when you're doing something that you believe in that has some hopeful, you know, some maybe, I don't know, consequence in eternity, however small that is. I know for me, and you know, we probably need to land the plane here soon, but one of the challenges I sometimes have is when I grew up in this family business, and I write this in my book, it was started by as strong a business person for Christ as I've ever met, and no offense to any of us included, but, you know, somebody has now become a friend, Stuart Johnson, is in the process of writing a book about him. He's a believer, and so I've read this manuscript a couple of times, and it's just blowing my socks off. It's just like, how could anybody be that good? When he died, his employees said, we've lost a kind and valued friend. There were no worker rights laws in Australia in the 1800s. Great dad, great, you know, husband, founded every charity that I can think of that existed in Sydney, and you name it, he was involved. And then you'll find this amusing. You know, sometimes you read something and you say, oh, come on, you can't be serious. So then, in addition to being one of the founders of the YMCA, he was one of the founders of YWCA. I read, like in 1860, he appointed a woman as a Sydney Morning Herald's correspondent in Paris. This is in a time when there were very few journalists who were women. So I'm thinking, are you kidding me? Of course he did. I mean, oh my gosh. I mean, seriously? I mean, being nominated as the journalist in Paris is a pretty big deal in 1860. So of course he did. So it's like, you know, how could anybody be that good? I mean, he must have had flaws somewhere, but I'm struggling to find them.
That sound that you heard, folks, and actually Warwick said it. The sounds you heard was Warwick suggesting that it was that the plane might be landing soon. And since that happened, I heard you probably heard the captain has turned on the fasten seatbelt sign, indicating that our conversation's coming in for a landing, but we're not there yet. So Warwick, as always, you have the right of final question or questions with our guest.
Well, maybe a final question and then a comment after the question. So, you know, there may be somebody listening or watching right now, and maybe today's their worst day, or maybe they've got some idea in their mind, to help others, but they feel like it's all too hard. What would a word of hope be for somebody that they kind of want to make a difference in the world? They want their life to count, but they're a bit overwhelmed, a bit afraid, and they don't quite know where to start or what to do, and they almost feel mildly depressed, thinking, gosh, I'd like to make a difference, but I don't know how, and it's just little old me. And what would a word of hope be to that person?
So, like we've all got passions and things that God's put on our hearts. Sometimes it might feel like you don't know what you're passionate about, but they've just been covered over by, you know, self-talk or by hard knocks in life. So it might take a bit of digging, but start to explore, what do I love? Even if it's just art, painting, even if you're not a good painter, I've got canvases where it's just like literally one colour, and then I love heart in the middle of the canvas, but I love the process of actually painting. So start to, even if it's just simply, the first step is just to write down some of these things that you like, that light you up. When I was in grief, when my granny died, I thought, geez, what gives me joy? Like, how am I going to get myself out of this? And I thought, meeting people. So I've never actually confessed this on air before or to anyone, but I thought, I'm going to go on the dating apps and see if I can just meet new people that way. So I did that, and I met some people. I felt sorry for everyone that came to meet me, because I was just not home. I was just feeling, I was so sad. But take that first tiny step that is Often we have these, like the big vision for my life. I've always had this utopian vision of a global network of business owners and organisation owners that can help each other and support each other, because we're all working in our own silos. That is a massive vision that would make me want to stay in bed with a doona over my head, because I don't know how to start that. But I trust that God will bring step by step. So I always love to say to someone, if you've got a vision or a goal, or even an area that you're passionate about, homelessness, for example, or start to, volunteer, or what is the first tiny little step, like Google organisations that work in that space, or first tiny little step that you can take to start exploring that more. And often, life will bring people in and, support you on that journey of curiosity and exploring.
Well, that's extremely helpful. I guess a comment I have, Stephanie, and I really want folks to kind of understand this about you, is that whether it's a for-profit business or a charity, NGO, it's easy for your identity to get wrapped up in what you do. Some people would say, who is Stephanie Woollard without being the head of 7 women? And it's like, well, nothing. My whole identity is wrapped up in that. Now, you're too smart and evolved, if you will, to fall into that trap. But you've seen it, I'm sure, often. CEOs, head of nonprofits, it's like it gets disillusioning, as I think you were sort of, talking about. So, none of us are immune. So I think for all of us, you've got to lean into whatever your faith construct, values construct, realize that your identity is not in what you do. We're children of God, at least from my perspective. We're certainly, there's some divine origin of our souls, however you look at it. So I really try to live that in my own small way. So when my book came out, and I don't know, a few years ago, 2022, I remember I was almost on my knees praying, Lord, I will not be defined by book sales, whether it sells 10, 1,000, 10,000. It doesn't make me a better person. And we're doing at Level Best to increase podcast downloads in our podcast, doing all the right things with a great team. And I'm all for doing what you can, but my identity is not in podcast downloads. So I really try and live that every day. I'm no better or worse than anybody else. And just to separate your identity from what you do, even if what you do is so wonderful. And it sure seems like you've done that. And that, to me, is one of the keys to success in the eternal sense of that word, is separate your identity from what you do and realize the spiritual battle is the daily struggle. Today might be a good day. It doesn't mean that if you believe in spiritual warfare, or, I don't know, however you look at it, the forces of light and darkness, every day is a new day in which, be ever vigilant, if you will. So, but we can learn a lot from you in that. And it sure seems like your identity is not wrapped up in what you do or who you've helped, which is remarkable. And so, if there was one lesson you could learn from Stephanie Woollard, I would say it would be that one. There's many others, but that would be top of my list, if you will. Mm-hmm. So.
Now, this is an unusual thing, folks, because normally what I'll say is I've been in the communications business long enough to know when the last word's been spoken on a subject, and then I name the guest and say he or she just spoke it. But the host just spoke it. Warwick just said something that is very appropriately sums up this conversation with Stephanie Woollard. She has indicated, you've indicated, Stephanie, you're not big into those kind of accolades. So I won't add many to say what Warwick said. That's all I'll say to you in terms of your character. And that, folks, I hope is what comes through in this conversation. So until the next time we're together, please remember that we know, you've heard it from Stephanie, you've heard it from Warwick, you've heard it from me before. We know that crucible experiences are difficult. Stephanie talked about lying in bed, weeping. They can be difficult, but here's what we also know. They're not the end of your story. They don't happen to you. They can happen for you. If you learn the lessons of those things that have knocked you off balance, those things that have caused you that trauma, that setback, that failure, If you learn the lessons of those things and you apply them to a vision moving forward for how you want to live your life, they can lead you to the best destination possible. And that destination is a life of significance. Welcome to a journey of transformation with the Beyond the Crucible assessment. Unlike any other, this tool is designed to guide you from adversity to achievement. As you answer a few insightful questions, you won't just find a label like the helper or the individualist. Instead, you'll uncover your unique position in the journey of resilience. This assessment reveals where you stand today, the direction you should aim for, and crucially, the steps to get there. It's more than an assessment. It's a roadmap to a life of significance. Ready? Visit beyondthecrucible.com. Take the free assessment and start charting your course to a life of significance today.